really excellent blog, Lost Garden, if anyone wants to check that out. That's how I actually heard of you and following a lot of your really detailed essays that you're writing. So that's, I think, a pretty good introduction, so I'll let you go forward.
So what I want, can everyone hear me? Yep. All right. So what I wanted to talk to you guys about today was this thing that's been bugging me for a while, and this concept of how games deliver value to players. I'm going to lead you through a series of experiments that I've been going through over the past few years, trying to figure out, like, all right, there's lots of ways that we can give value to players. So what's the best way of doing that? So this is my company. We co-founded.
Our presentation's not.
Oh my God! Check out this cool thing that you can't see. All right. So I co-founded Spryfox with David Edery a few years ago, and we sort of left the console world. I used to work at Microsoft, and before that, Epic Mega Games. But back when it was Mega Games, because you had to distinguish. We went into this indie world of smaller projects because there was all sorts of exciting stuff happening with new platforms opening up and new opportunities to do these sort of experimental games that have always been buzzing around in my head. By the way, if you work at a large company and you've been working on the same game for like 2 to 3 years and it never seems to release, I highly recommend stepping outside of that, finding a hobby, and releasing small games on your own, because you can actually get stuff done. It's really kind of a freeing experience. So Steambirds, Panda Poet, for the hardcore folks are there, Realm of the Mad God, Triple Town, we've got a new one coming out called Leap Day, sort of a cooperative transportation game that's all multiplayer and persistent. All these are small games. Most of the teams, none of the teams were above 5 people. Pretty much all of them except Panda Poet and Leap Day, which isn't released, have been played by millions of people around the world. So large distribution, all sorts of different platforms. We've experimented with web and mobile and you name it. Pretty much the only place I'm avoiding right now is console, and I'll get into that as a reason why in a moment. So this is something I'm completely and utterly obsessed with, which is how do games efficiently add value to the world? And there's sort of 2 phrases there that are important. Value, like what is this thing called value, and I'll talk about that a little bit. And then efficiency, like how to efficiently add value to the world. And that efficiently part comes from, I don't know, it's almost like a famine time in my career, where when I started out, we were making shareware games, and the cost to make a game was, 1 or 2 developers, maybe $40,000. I'm being generous there. It was, we were putting these things on discs, you were doing it out of passion, and you get these remarkably outsized returns because people would pay you money for these little small games that you were making. This was back in around the mid-90s. And then I witnessed over the next decade or so this escalating cost curve. And now it's you can easily, these are probably underestimates of the modern development teams. 100 devs and $40 to $80 million is commonplace on the high-end console markets. And I found that the quality of design that I could do personally was less because I wasn't able to, I was suddenly one person in a very, very large team, in an 80-person team. And my ability to impact things wasn't as good. I'm a small team sort of person, so personally that frustrated me. Also, there was a tendency to be conservative because when you have 40 to 80 to $100 million at risk, suddenly it's really difficult to say, you know what, we're going to do something crazy. And there's a 90% chance it's going to fail, but what the heck, right? So that was a source of creative frustration for me. And you say, well, that's not an issue now. We've got mobile and we've got Flash, and I'm kind of like someone who survived a famine, and I'm like, waving the big sign like, no, the end times are going to come again. Because if you look at platforms, platforms go through a very distinct life cycle where they mature over time. So console retail is perhaps one of the most mature platforms that are out there. And you've seen, like, XBLA used to be this wonderful spot where indie developers could go and make a lot of money and get their games in really easily. That's not the case anymore. That market has essentially shut down, and there's only a very few people who are able to make an impact there. And so as the platforms mature, then you tend to see these escalating cost curves. Mobile is going through this right now. The cost to make a top 10 free-to-play game has increased dramatically, and you're seeing orders of magnitude increase in the cost to make one of these traditional, what used to be a success type games. So I look at that, and this is where my gut feeling like we need to be more efficient about how we design games comes from. So this is kind of a vague equation that I use, and we put metrics around it to make it seem a little more scientific than it is. It's a ratio. We've got developer years in on one side, and we've got quality hours out on the other. And these are nuanced terms. Developer years, like I can take an average developer, who works, a year and they have an output. But, I can have skilled developers in there as well, or unskilled developers. And but let's for the moment, let's assume there's this ideal like developer year that you can put into a project. And then on the other side, you have hours of play. Now, what you find is that the quality hours of play becomes a really important concept, because I can get people to play something for a very long period of time, and the quality of that experience is absolute crap. So it's very easy to do this. So we actually measure this, and this is a crude method, and we're getting a little more accurate about how we measure that quality thing. But we ask people, and we track, so are you having fun? How fun is this game? Would you recommend this to a friend? And then there's a whole bunch, if you go down, there's some positive psychology survey questions you can ask about what is the quality of this experience that you're having. You can track that over time. And if you're into metrics, we're used to tracking retention and when people fall out. We're used to tracking engagement, how long do they play. But I think the quality of the experience also ends up mattering. And so we can look at this and we can say, all right, this is our rough sort of internal metric, but if they're scoring 4 out of 5 in general, they're saying that if they're having fun, then we'll say those are quality hours. It's kind of arbitrary, but if it's less than 4 out of 5, they're not having fun, but they're still playing the game. Maybe those aren't quality hours. And as a designer, I know that I feel like like I'm a Sims character, and there's an hourglass above my head, and it's constantly ticking down sands of time. And my life is extraordinarily limited. And every single thing I design, I can be wasting that time, or I can be making good use of it. And the same thing is for every single player that you have. You can be wasting their time, or you can be making good use of it. So I look at this and say, wow, I have this huge responsibility to create quality play within the game. So the experiment that I've been doing is I said, historically I know we can always dump more developers on and increase the developer years. There's a whole other talk there, what that means and how you can scale developer years and what activities scale. But that's not what this talk is about. This talk is about saying, let's fix that. Let's assume a team of 1 to 2 developers, maybe an artist, maybe a part-time designer, small teams, less than 10. And then if you fix that, the design problem becomes, how do we increase the quality hours given a limited amount of pre-production and production and design activity? So it's really, that's the challenge. And these are my experiments. This is what I've tried to do. So this was my first attempt, and this is what, if you look at games historically, particularly computer games or video games, that horrible console-centric world of video games, it's been media focused. It's been, let's go and throw media at the problem. So I did an experiment in this. This is an earlier game of mine called Bunny. And it's kind of, you can think of it as it's the harvesting portion of a real-time strategy game. It's not a high skill game, but it's generally quite narratively driven. There's conversation dialogues and there's characters that you get to know and care about. And there's a plot, there's a very bizarre plot that ends up with a marriage and bunny strippers, and it's very strange. It's very disturbing. But the programmer got really, really drunk one night. And he was from Australia, and he was upset about living in Australia, which, because he gets that way sometimes. And he said, because I'm drunk and because I'm living in Australia, I'm going to animate stripper bunnies. And that made it into the game. Very strange moment of that development process. But it worked, and it's actually one of the moments of the game that a certain population loves, because it's this concept of you can build a game out of arcs, and they're arcs of, there's an interaction to it, but the interaction is almost secondary. It's an execution in order to get to this really rich, strong, evocative feedback. And so the evocative feedback, like you see an amazing picture or you see some stunning experience, and it hits your brain, and your brain goes ding, 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 and stimulated, and you start remembering that time in your childhood when you were on the swing and you were at the peak of the swing, and it was the first time you ever experienced that, and you're like, oh, this game brings that back, and I feel wonderful. So that evocative experience ends up being really, really critical, so we try to build those in. This is like traditional techniques 101, right? Most games do this, most video games do this a lot. It's kind of like the standard way of making at least video games. Now there's a problem with this, is evocative stimuli, people burn through that stuff like crazy. It's like flipping pages in a book, right? You add some video, they look at the video, it registers. Some people it's a lifelong experience and they stay with it forever, but most people it just flows in one ear, tickles a little neurons, and goes out the other. So what you do is you create sequences of these. You put stacked arcs on top of arcs, and you load up the sequences of evocative stimuli. And that's exactly what Bunny did. Now, again, going back to our sort of equation there, there's a problem with this in that you end up on this content treadmill. And the content treadmill is, in order to keep the player going, I need to keep making new content. So there's this one-to-one relationship of, I make stuff, they consume it. I need to make more stuff and consume it. So every tick of the, every piece of sand that drops through, your timekeeping device is costing the developer one piece of sand as well. So it's this one-to-one relationship. Make content, consume content. Make content, consume content. And it never ends. So you get this very tight relationship. For Bunny, it was basically one developer year to about 2.5 hours of playtime. As an aside, you can multiply all these hours out if you want to really scare yourself sometime. Like Bunny, even though it's a simple little game, around 3 million people ended up playing it. So that's 1,027 years of human life that this little pornographic bunny stripper game consumed. And I sometimes lay awake at night and think about that. Perspective. So So my second attempt was a sort of a different direction. But what about capital goods? And it's a specific economic term, and we'll walk through that. But people like stuff, right? And people seem to value stuff, and they buy big houses with garages so that they can collect stuff. So maybe people seem to value stuff, so let's give them a game that's about stuff. And there's a reason why they like stuff. There's an economic reason why stuff is interesting. Stuff is often a class of good, not always, but it's often a class of good that's called a capital good. And what that does is it ends up being a tool for you to gain more resources. The reason that we fill our garages with stuff is because we bought something because we thought it would be useful to us. And it was like, oh, there's this, the thing that refrigerates my wine is going to be so incredibly useful to me because I can collect wine and it will improve the experience of drinking wine so that when I get more wine, it's going to be more valuable because it will be nicely chilled when I actually experience it. And it ends up being this like instinctual thing to collect these tools and hoard them and one day potentially make use of them. Oh, by the way, has anyone read Joris Doorman's work on internal economies? He did this thing called Machinations. It's probably one of the best advances in game design theory over the past 5 years. And it's all about how these resources are transferred through various internal economies of the game. Highly, highly recommended if you haven't seen it. I think the book is called Advanced Game Mechanics. And it's all about this. So this one is Steambirds Survival. And the stuff that we were having people collect was planes. And so you'd earn currency to get planes. And the planes would in turn let you earn more currency. It's it's a radically complex loop there. And most games end up going down this route. So I simplify things, but this is pretty much this one, the capital goods and the media are pretty much how we do our job. So this is a kind of a brutal overview. Now, one of the things I noticed with this is you end up with these diminishing returns. At a certain point, making more planes is difficult. The value of each additional plane is less. And you can think of it in terms of the fun space or the play space for your game. And what you find is every time you add one of these capital goods, which is essentially a tool, to your game, you're populating more of this play space with opportunities and efficiencies for the player. And at a certain point, these things start overlapping and they start borrowing from each other and they start getting fuzzy. And so you can only add so much stuff to your game before the incremental value of each capital good that you add becomes less. So there's limits to this, which is sad because it works pretty well when it's working. And so here we were able to get quite a bit more quality hours out of the game. 10 hours for every dev year we put in, which is decent. Better than just pure efficient in terms of efficiency than just throwing content at it. So at this point, my background is also in physics and in math, and I said, well, there's got to be let's actually use some combinatorics and exponentials and all that good stuff, right? So I ran into the same problem in Tripletown, and there's a collection of stuff aspect of the game there, and so is anyone familiar with the story of this is the mythological or whatever story of how chess was invented and sold to the first publisher? Yes. So the idea was that someone invented chess, and they brought it to the ruler of India, And the ruler said, I really want this. I want to buy this from you. And the wise chess designer was like, absolutely. Here's my price. My price is 1 grain of rice for the first square, 2 grains of rice for the second square, 4 grains for the third square, and so on, doubling every single square as you go. And the publisher, the leader of India, was not very keen on math, so he said, that sounds like a cheap price. So he said, absolutely, I'll go for it. And it turns out that it's an exponential progression, and it ends up being thousands of tons of rice once you actually calculate it out, far more than the production of rice in India. And at that point, he executed the designer, which is unfortunate. So we did the same thing in Tripletown. We said, Tripletown, it has this mechanic where you match 3 items and you get a new item that's of a higher tier, and you match 3 of those, and so on and so forth. And so we had people collecting these utilitarian goods, but you had to collect them on this exponential scale of collection. And we calculated it out. To reach tier 30, it's going to basically take players about 5 billion years. It's like, this was a clever hack. This works. This is actually extraordinarily effective in sort of stretching out players' engagement with the game. But, found a problem. It does, for the players who engage in this, they're very excited about it. And they're happy to go down this exponential progression. But then there's the players who end up grinding. And they're doing it, and they enjoy the first few hours, but then they look ahead and they see the next billion hours, and they're like, I suppose I'll do it. And what's weird is they don't necessarily stop, but the quality of their time with the game goes down dramatically. So I'm wasting their life by going and being clever and creating a billion years of content for them. So that was kind of math is great, but it doesn't always work when mixed with human psychology. This is the thing that this is like, this is my trump card right here, which is skill. I was like, maybe we can increase value through skill, because skill's awesome, and hard games are awesome, and I like hard games, so therefore that's the magic answer to this efficiency equation. And there's a huge amount of economic theory around this. So just Google human capital when you get a chance. And it's this idea that people, by learning skills, by mastering these useful skills, they end up improving their effectiveness and productivity in the world, and they transform their lives in this very, very meaningful way. And what we're doing right here is, in some ways, improving our skills to better our lives. And that's a deep, deep motivator for most people. And you could argue that it's absolutely critical to who we are as tool-using human beings. Now, given this concept of skill and human capital, Tripletown is a skillful puzzle game. So puzzle is such a horribly polluted word. It's really, I think of it as a single-player tactics and strategy game. And it's all about placement and organization and planning ahead. And a good player plans ahead anywhere from 20 to 50 moves when they're playing Tripletown. This is the board of a fellow named Stefan Bura, who is another game designer. And he is constantly sending me his scores, showing me what a horrible player I am. And his score is around 62 million. Just to put that in perspective, about 80% of the players barely break 50,000 in Tripletown. So this is mildly insane. We had to actually extend the width of the score box just for Stefan. Bad planning on my part. But it's very skillful play, and he's created videos that show people how to play the game. He gets immense value from that. And for the people who make it through, there's a skill barrier. There's a skill barrier where most people drop off. Like 90% of people will drop off and never make it to the high skill portions of these high skill games. But that remaining like 10% or 20%, depending on your game, is going to play for hundreds or thousands of hours. Your game becomes a hobby for them. So we're no longer feeding them content. Instead, we've created a hobby that people can invest maybe their lives in advancing their skills and mastering their skills. And that's kind of exciting. That's like an order of, if you make a high skill game that people can invest in, that's like an order of magnitude increase in the efficiency of your game design, according to this fun little equation. And then I get this tweet. Where has the day gone? I've accomplished just about nothing. Improving my triple down skills really doesn't count. This is another I lay awake at and said, why? So games are this this self-contained value system. The value. Why is a point valuable? Because we have because we use the point in the game to buy these other things, which are valuable because they earn points, right? You end up getting these people see them as these self-contained value systems. They're not always. There are links outside the world. It's a permeable barrier. But if you have immense amount of skill within a game, it doesn't necessarily translate to the broader world. So you see this when a parent watches their child play a game. Let's say they're playing like Tony Hawk or whatever it is, and they're watching their kid, and the kid's doing this crazy thing, and scores are going up, and the parents are like, that's the dumbest thing I've ever seen. Because their value structure has nothing to do with the value structure that the player has created, has bought into inside the game. So even though the skill of playing Triple Town is amazing and awesome, it doesn't really connect with people's lives outside of that game. So status. This is just a quick one. So we add in leaderboards. I mean, how many people here have been, well, I've got a game and it's pretty good, but we need something extra, and people ask me, what's the point? So we added in leaderboards. How many people have done that here? I've done it. And it works. Status is really fundamental stuff. It really deeply ties into the real world. I bet every single one of you is carrying some sort of status item on your body right now. Either your badge or the clothes that you're wearing, or particular shoes that show how you're a little more special than everybody else. Status is really fundamental to our sort of tribal, ape-like human condition. So it's really easy to do. You get resources from the person who's got either more skill or more capital goods. We put them on a pedestal and we say, you're awesome. Stefan, here's Stefan compared to everybody else. He is awesome. He has an awesome French accent and he has a high Triple Town score. How do you beat that? Now, the downside here is that poor David, who only has 3 million points, feels a bit like crap, and he doesn't feel so good. And so you end up with this interesting thing. One of my favorite studies is the Whitehall study on English civil servants, and they basically looked at like high status versus low status people who were pretty much doing the exact same job. So their skills were identical, but because of the structure of English society, they had been set up in such a way that there was a high status group and a low status group. The low status group had 3 times the mortality of the high status jobs. So even though you could say, well, it's positive for those high status people, but for the low status people, it actually causes immense psychological stress and kills them. So you can add a leaderboard into your game, and all you're doing, you're helping some people, you're killing the rest. And there's this wonderful study about high status and low status individuals in a problem-solving setting. So they bring people in and say, all right, we've tested you outside and we know that you're smart and we know your capabilities. And then we're going to bring you in and we're going to put you in a high status environment and low status environment. They rig things, right? They tell people what their status is. And what they noticed is that the low status people acted dumb in the presence of the high status people. So not only are we creating situations where we're hurting people's health, we're also creating situations where we're not getting the most out of people. So someone who has immense investment in these, this human capital of their mind and their skills ends up being put in a low status situation and they act like an idiot because the penalty is there's status penalties associated with them acting out of their particular class. Quite fascinating stuff. So again, we end up, like leaderboards will often get you like 10 to 50% improvement, but there's a cost to that. So at this point, I stumbled upon this thing I think of as value engines. Up till now, everything I've been talking about is really stuff that you as a designer make or create, and then the player consumes. And when we think of ourselves as designers, often we think of ourselves as we're people who make things, right? And then we show them to people and we get positive feedback because they like them. And that's when I worked on an MMO, and Eve probably, the talk on Eve hints on this quite strongly, but we added trade into a game. And trade blew my mind, it's rather amazing. So the basic concept of trade is there's something that's producing some sort of asset in your game, and there's a specialization in the collection of that asset. So we have a pool here that's, a player is collecting asset A, right? Let's say that's hot dogs. They're specialized in collecting hot dogs. Then you have another person down here who's specialized in collecting buns. Now, because they're specialized, they each collect an excess of that particular good. You introduce trade into the mix, this amazing thing called trade. And now we can trade our hot dogs and our buns, and now I've got a hot dog and bun, and it is a transformative act. I no longer have a chunk of meat, I have a whole meal, and it's got interesting flavors to it, and I can do other things. I can put ketchup or relish on that thing. And it's this, it's really kind of this amazing thing. It's a non-zero sum act. This is what, when so people critique capitalism, they often make this mistake. Capitalism creates value. There's more value through trade than when you start. Because the hot dog plus the bun is more valuable to me than just the hot dog by itself. And two hot dogs is not nearly as interesting as this this crafted item that comes out of mixing those different resources. It's also a mutually beneficial act. So, like, I've actually helped out someone else. It's a relationship act. So by doing this, I needed to communicate and negotiate with another person in order to make this trade thing happen. So this is Realm of the Mad God. And let me tell you the radical, crazy, complex design process that we did to enable this scene right here. This is hundreds of people trading with each other, yelling out prices, bartering, so on and so forth. The feature that we added was the ability to drop items on the ground. And by dropping items on the ground, people started creating this trade culture. And they started modifying the game and making like entirely new applications that enabled trade. And what we saw was this kind of this explosion of, I think of it as culture, cultural norms. So in order to trade with each other, it's a highly inefficient process for dropping things on the floor. So there were trading norms, there were ways of communicating with each other. People created languages for talking about what they want, how they could get it, what they're offering in a very efficient fashion. We didn't have any money in the game, so people started creating unofficial currencies. So there was a particular potion that dropped from a particular rare dungeon, and people would go and take that and they'd stockpile them and then use them to trade. And some people would try to capture the market on that particular unofficial currency, and there became trading houses where you'd have like, oh, this person has created 1,000 mules and they have a script to automate getting items out of those mule accounts to act, and they'll go and act as an exchange system for these trade items. We had advocacy groups. So essentially, the rate at which we dropped potions in a particular monster in a particular dungeon was the Federal Reserve. And when we changed the drop rates, it was people would complain. They'd be like, oh my God, they're changing the drop rates. The money supply is going to change like this, and then the prices are going to collapse, and then my investment in this particular class of weapon is going to go down, and the world's coming to an end. So quick, let's put together an advocacy group and lobby the developers for how they should change. And they're like, and they'd be very official about it, and they'd say, here's how much money we have to offer you. We only want an increase of 0.005% because that will change our rates like this, and we're okay with that. We realize you can't do more than that. It became very complex from a very simple thing. Trust networks. People would come up with trust networks, like who do I trade with, who do I trust? Because if I drop something on the floor, you pick it up, and then you don't give me anything back. Scandal. So this is something that MMOs have known for ages, but I hadn't had the opportunity to design an MMO, so this was kind of a shock to me. And it blew my mind. And it made me think, what if we're thinking about games completely wrong? What if instead of delivering these packages of value, what instead, like our goal is as game designers, is to create these engines, these little tiny rule systems that instead generate value. And what if we think of players not as consumers of value, but what if they're these energy cells, and our job is to activate them, which is a very, very different sort of perspective for me. And you see these massive efficiencies gains. Like that system of trade in that game is just exploding. It keeps growing and changing, and it's like it's 10 times the amount of interestingness as a leaderboard. And there's real relationships that are being formed. And when you measure people whether they like this, they love it. We've gone beyond a hobby and we've gone into a lifestyle for many of these people. And well, there's other ways, like, so I started looking. I started like, well, that's cool. Are there the other engines of creating value? And large creative goals. This talk would not be complete, by the way, does everyone have alcohol on them? Because if you do, you're supposed to drink every time you see a Minecraft reference. Take a shot right now. So Minecraft, I'm going to critique Minecraft. Minecraft is a horrible, horrible piece of media. It has these crude, ugly blocks. The plot is childish. Kill a dragon. That's like, or survive the night, kill a dragon. There's almost nothing there in terms of like plot or narrative. However, given how horrible it is, at how much it fails at all the ideals that AAA games have pursued for the past decade or so, it still ends up being this amazing value generator. It creates human capital. You can think of people gaining skill within the game, and like this is the Star Trek Enterprise. Someone made that. Can you imagine the skill that it takes to make that? Mind blowing. And social capital. People are like fathers and are playing with their children and saying, hey, let's spend some quality time together and let's play Minecraft. So they're working together, the kids are getting together, and it's like their after-school activity is to come together and hang out on a server and work with each other using, making worlds. It does have some of the traditional game mechanics and syncs and so on and so forth that you see in other games. But all that is swamped by its ability to create cultural artifacts. So, remember I said Bunny was kind of one of these failures for me? Well, it ends up that I wasn't looking hard enough. The world of Bunny resonated with people. So we created a forum, and hundreds of thousands of people went to the forum, and then they started creating Bunny fan fiction, which was a lot more tame than you might expect given the contents of the game. And we had thousands upon thousands of posts where people were creating these long, intricate, player-created stories from this world of Bunny. And it was amazing. You'd go in there, and there was for about a year, there was this long-standing thread of people role-playing a tavern in Bunny, and they were hanging out together, and like there was the bunnies and the foxes, and they would talk to each other, and there was different characters, and then there was the drunk guy, and it was all like it's one of the characters in the game is drunk like all the time. It's a game for children. And like kids like that sort of thing for some strange reason. I think it's honest. They like the honesty. So this concept of fan fiction really is something that comes out of, if you do it just right, you can actually trigger this explosion of, again, player creativity, what we look at as fan fiction. Now, there's a lot of these pictures out there. If you ever do an internet search, it's a lot of them. I've got a bunch stored up just for my personal enjoyment. It made me think that if you look at other ways of reactions to games, we talk about how sometimes game journalism ends up being this sort of like fanboy club or expression of love for the game is why a lot of game journalists do their job. Not all of them, but it ends up being, I almost think of game journalism as another version of fan fiction. It's this reaction to the game, right? It's this and I noticed some people who may be pressed. But game criticism I see as the same sort of thing. It's more coming from an academic perspective, but it's this like taking the seed of the game and then riffing on it in this crazy, convoluted, sort of very inward-looking way to create their own sort of game on top of the game. And again, that's the sort of this explosion outward from this very small seed. Lots of engines out there. We've got these creative tribes. We've got sports. Governance has come up a couple times already. Governments are kind of this. They have very strong game-like structures, and they're relatively minimalist, but they have a huge impact on our culture and our world. Religions. Oh my God. I mean, think about it. Here's a rule book that's about yay thick, and it's resulted in thousands of years of culture and patterns and rules. I'm fascinated by religions these days, and I look at religions and I say, what can we steal from religions to make our games better? So again, what are we looking at here? Where this is sort of the model that I came into this with. Creator makes content, feeds it to a consumer. We market it, we sell it, we try to create this sort of artificial culture around it so people will buy into it. And it's just, again, it just ends up not being very efficient. So we load up the developer side of the equation because we can't really get much out of we get diminishing returns out of the game side of the equation. So instead, I've started to think about things in terms of like, what if you're a creator who's building an engine? That engine creates a community. The community generates culture. And I think we can design for this. This is an open question, and I'm happy to talk more about this. What makes one of these generative value engines? And this is my short list, and there's probably more here. Systems that build positive relationships, beneficial relationships between people seems to work. Often that's a multiplayer game, but not always. Sometimes you have games you share with each other that are a piece of content. Persistence. Is the thing you're making, is there permanence to it in some way? So that it's not something that you do and then immediately goes away. Specialization. Do the people who are participating in the game, does each one have something a little unique that they get out of it that is different from what someone else gets out of it, so that there is benefit in either trading capital goods or knowledge goods or social goods, so that they're richer through through trade. Is it better with a group? There's so many things you can apply that to. Is this better with a group? And there's certain activities that aren't better with groups. You add more people and it becomes worse. So I always think of this like my rule of thumb is better together. Whenever I'm designing co-op games, I want people to be able to play by themselves, but when they're working together, it's a wonderful experience and an interesting experience. Shareable artifacts, you get something that you can trade with people. And then the biggest one is this non-zero sum gaming, where it's not like there was a tweet a little while back about like competitive gaming, and it's like, yeah, we've created value, and then I get to take it from you, right? It's kind of like we've created a bunch of stuff for people to collect and share and understand, but there's a limited amount of it, and so in these competitive games, there's only so much to go around. Is there ways you can tweak the system so that there's, by investing in our skills, by investing in our relationships, what you end up getting out of the game is a lot more than the limited stuff that you've put into it. And that's a tricky one, because a lot of the tropes that we use are zero-sum tropes. And it makes it, you have to throw out a lot in order to get back at these generators of value. Now, these are still games. It's easy to think, well, we're in some fluffy, open sandbox land where everything's, just free form and happy and people just make stuff up. I haven't found that to be the case. You still need this sort of scaffolding. So these systems, they start with rules. You have these critical rules that set up the constraints of the world. And then you need to interact with those. Individuals need to be able to build mastery within that system, and they need to be able to learn it and understand it. And that's one of the things that digital games do so well. Like board games have a fundamental limitation on them in that the processing of a board game's rules happens in the player's head while they're playing. And that only scales up so far. With computer games, we can go and we can create these complex systems, and we can introduce them to the player piecemeal, and we can automate away sections of this complex rule set that they don't want to deal with, or it's not interesting for them to deal with. So that's core game design stuff. And then once you have that, then you say, well, how do groups interact with that? You know, we've got these skilled players, now let's integrate them into groups. And there's I don't know if anyone's noticed here, but there's a multiplayer revolution going on right now. For the past like 20 years or 30 years, we've been focused on single player games. And everyone I talk to is making a multiplayer game. Like it's gone from, 80-20 to flipping, So 80% of people are now making multiplayer games. That's a pretty huge shift. And the reason is that you get all these wonderful benefits from groups interacting with each other. And then on top of that, you've got this crazy thing, this cultural thing. So what are the social norms that the groups create for each other? How do they interact? What are those larger scale systems that occur there? And the first three we do as designers already. What is new to me is taking into account that cultural aspect. So, and this is a very sort of like odd way of looking at it. I feel like a dictator gardener, where I'm trying to dictate a culture, but the culture pushes back at me, and so I have to prune and tweak, and I have all the power in the world to a certain degree, but I'm controlling this crazy amorphous, second and third degrees interaction between players. And they push back and create something. And so as the dictator gardener, I kind of have to go and say, all right, do I reward them or do I kill them? Or do I do some nuanced version of in between? And the nuanced aspects don't really help work all that well. Because the culture is so far out from your rules that it's like this wobbly, jello-y connection. It doesn't quite hook up as well as you'd like. But this is a immense responsibility. I look forward and I see that we're only going to be more online. People are only going to find meaning in their life through games more, not less. And we're going to have millions of people, probably billions of people, who are building their community and their culture and their art around our games. And we have a immense power to shape that. Probably like no other group of people ever in the history of time. Perhaps early on, you had, a dictator might be able to do this. Someone who was an emperor of an early civilization might be able to do this. But as game designers, we're in a similar role. And we have this, have you ever heard Lawrence Lessig says the term code is law? We're essentially creating legal systems, and we are the legislative, we are the executive branch, we are the judicial branch for these worlds that have millions of people in them. And that's an immense responsibility. But I'm just making small games with small teams and like 10 people. So I tend to think of it in perhaps a little more of a anarchist sort of way. I'm not going to waste my time making content. I'm not going to waste my time making media. What I'm going to try to do is I'm going to try to drop a rule set into the ocean of humanity and create an ever-expanding tidal wave of value. This seems like an efficient use of my time and an efficient use of the player's time. Any questions?
Yeah. Any questions?
Yes.
So we were talking about the sort of relationship between a developer and players in a way that's not like a consumer. What's your opinion about, and this has sort of become more of a recent thing, about companies companies releasing development tools in order to increase the lifetime of their game. Kind of like how Valve has released, public versions of Hammer, of the Workshop for hats, or the SFM. What is your opinion about that?
Love it. It's not really a recent trend. We've been doing it. Mod communities have been around for ages, and people have been hacking games for ages. And I think Counter-Strike exists because they opened up the ability to mod the game, and it's wonderful. We should do more of that. One of the things we did in Realm of Mad God is we crowdsourced all the art. Pixel art's really easy to make, so let's go and just ask people. So we'd say, hey, we're doing a new dungeon, and this is the theme. It's going to be an underwater theme. Make underwater art for us. And so they did, and there'd be hundreds of pieces of art. And what ended up happening is they invested skill and time in making the art, and then now they had this thing that they could share and talk about with their friends in the game as well. They're like, oh, by the way, I made this thing. Check it out. And they're like, wow, your stuff got into the game, and everyone was excited. So it was a huge net positive. I think one of the interesting challenges going forward is as we have these online locked down systems, how do we enable people to create moddable environments within that? So if you have a World of Warcraft, what does the mod tools look like for World of Warcraft that actually gets into the game and messes with this very subtle and delicate balance? Yes?
First of all, great talk, and I think this is a really valuable lens for a designer. But when you're talking about efficiency, and you're talking about trying to create, hopefully hundreds of hours of experience for the gamer, I'm thinking, in my personal experience, my problem is not finding enough good things to fill my time, because there's plenty of them. My problem is that I don't have enough hours already for the stuff I'd like to experience. And so, one of the things I really liked about, for instance, Dear Esther, was that it was over in an hour and a half. And I know I can play it again, but I felt like I got a really complete experience.
Right.
And knowing that not all 4 out of 5 games are created equal, I've always been thinking about this as trying to create sort of the most value-dense time for my players. And so I guess I'm wondering, do you think that's also a good path for designing to take?
So it's not the path that I go for. I think there are diminishing returns on that path. Like Dear Esther is an example. Like for some people it was a meaningful experience, and for other people it wasn't. And there's a certain quality limit that you can get to. Once you're dealing with like, oh, here's The Wire, here's Mad Men, here's Glee, and let's say they're 5% difference in quality between them, maybe 10%, depends on your perspective, right? It's like, okay, I can only get, this is in the 98th percentile or the 99th percentile of quality density. And so there's only so much you can tune that up, in my opinion. But that's my personal take on it. And that's exactly the style of play that I want to run as far away from as humanly possible.
Are you saying quality adheres to the object itself?
No, not necessarily. Well, Dear Esther is actually interesting because we're talking about it, right? So there's value in it as this artifact that spawns conversation. In fact, there's probably more value in the conversation than the actual artifact
But
itself.
when you say percentage of quality, do you mean an objective
An
quality or for a person, graphics or vary per person?
The subjective quality is a topic that's nearly impossible to talk about. What we can do is we can come up with metrics, and we can come up with scales, and we can look at
But
populations.
you can talk about it with so forthrightly. That's exactly why I'm asking.
Because what we do is we say here's our scale of quality that we're going to measure on, and then we survey a population of people. So you can look at averages, but you can't say, how did this particular piece of content change this person's life so they married this girl 5 years later? Like that's a really hard thing to measure.
But that sort of.
I want to jump into this too. While hanging up on you.
No.
Yeah, great talk, great question. I was having the same thought. Like the way I was thinking about it was, Some of my favorite games, some of the most beautiful games I've ever experienced, and I think some of the most powerful and moving game experiences are not fun at all. Like, they're just filled with suffering. And maybe a single moment of transcendence,
Yep.
but that most of it is filled with practice, you know?
Sure.
Practice, you know? And it's like suffering through practice. You wake up at 5 a.m. and then you're like going and running on the track, and then you're urinating blood. You know what I mean? And then maybe at the end of the season you get one glorious moment of it.
Right.
So like that doesn't quite fit into the scheme of measurements, you know, and surveys and data-driven design.
What's interesting is you can measure those things. People do measure the sense of well-being that you get from feeling mastery, from feeling a higher shared purpose with others, right? When you're running, there's probably something, you're running for a reason. If you were just like peeing blood all the time, you'd probably stop. But there's actually stuff that ties into, and there's whole fields of psychology about how do we measure well-being and the positive emotions. And there's negative aspects about this. The positive psychology has actually gotten away from happiness. It used to be the study of happiness, and study of happiness is kind of like our study of fun. It's like, well, if you want to live the good life, being happy all the time probably isn't how you want to do it. Because there are those moments of investment and learning and pain and suffering, and that, when hazing, has anyone studied hazing here? Hazing is this horrible experience, and yet it has this hugely positive correlation with group coherency. So like people who are hazed in massively horrible ways end up sticking together as a group and having really, really deep social bonds with that group. And if you interview them, then it turns out that they see hazing as this necessary entrance into this transformational group identity. So it's not always the simple metrics of measure fun doesn't necessarily work, which is why we've moved towards moving towards some of these concepts of well-being. There's actually there's a model called PERMA, which I actually have a slide on someplace here that it takes into account a lot of this stuff. Now, if this was Nintendo, there would be a warning. I can't find it. Never mind.
There's one thing there's one form of value that I think you might also add to this, which we have found. My analogy there is on when you see advertisement for SUVs, you usually see people somewhere in some tracks on mountains. Well, their real use of these cars are usually just to pick up kids in suburbia somewhere.
Uh-huh.
And I think that people like to have that car with the idea that they might do this, even though they will never do it.
Yeah.
And this we see, for example, a lot of our players do PvE, but they like the idea that they could do PvP
Right.
if they ever wanted. It's like, so that's a latent value they have, and they're quite happy just doing the PvE just because they know they could do the other thing, even though they don't.
It's potential. It's a potential capital good, even though you're not exercising that at all. Yeah, it's not actually utility that's made available.
I'm curious, as a founder of your company, how do you equate paying salaries with making people's lives better? Is it, I make people's lives better, therefore they give me money? Or you could build a beautiful, wonderful product that gets this culture around it, but no money ever returns back to you. The culture, they have no way of handing money to you because they love you. Or, maybe you talk about religions a bit, they just give you these tithes. Thank you for doing this. How does that play into the business aspect of the things you talked about in this talk?
Oh, hugely. Are you asking about the people who make the game, or are you talking about the
I'm talking
people
about
who
you
play
as somebody who's running a business and trying to pay your developers their salary every month. And there's a lot of examples of people who make these beautiful games, but they haven't figured out how to monetize them.
Right.
correctly, and so they release these drop 7, sorry Frank, gems into the world, and they don't really see like a return of, but people love it, and you know their critics think it's great and all sorts of things, but there's no money flowing back into the development process.
It's a huge issue. I mean, it motivates a lot of my thinking here. There's another sort of like, you know, the horrible Russian winter that I've gone through is when you look at a lot of game releases, there's a big bang release where you push really hard to make a release date, and then you sell a lot of copies, and 2 weeks later your game is discounted, and now you've got 2 years of emptiness. Where there's hopefully money in the bank, but it's slowly going down, and you hope to God that your next game is a hit, and if it isn't, you're dead. So one of the things I look at when I'm making these games is this, like, I don't want to ever go through that again. So what I'm really interested in is these ongoing streams of revenue. And what I've noticed with these sort of like games that have value engines in them is we're constantly delivering value, and the community is constantly generating value. So, and that can go on for years. And if you insert yourself correctly into that value generation process, for example, in a trade system, there's all sorts of wonderful ways you can actually tax the currencies that are going back and forth. Now, they're building value sort of on their own, the players are, with this thing that you've seeded, and you're maintaining it and so on and so forth, but you're siphoning off this steady stream of revenue from that, which is one of the reasons why, like when we make games, all our games going forward, they tend to be multiplayer, they tend to be free to play, they tend to have trade systems in them, you know, so there's a lot of like, that knowledge goes into how we make money.
I think that's all we have time for, sorry. But